Milosevic's crimes in Kosovo. He didn't ask why that limit was imposed. It's an interesting question, but let's put it aside. Actually, it's not quite accurate either. It's not for Milosevic's crimes in Kosovo. It's for his crimes after March 24th, 1999. If you read the indictment, you find that virtually every crime mentioned that's the day when the U.S. NATO bombing began. Virtually everything mentioned is some crime that took place after the bombing. There are reasons for that time frame as well, carefully evaded in the huge literature that's come out about this topic. Come back to it if you like, but I'll skip it now. Anyway, it's a fact. Virtually nothing in the indictment, few things, but very little before the bombing. So the war crimes trials are in fact for crimes within a very specific time frame, namely the crime, and they're real crimes, no doubt about that, the crimes committed under NATO bombing. The crimes that were incidentally anticipated and not very surprising. Doesn't change the fact that they're crimes. Well, without proceeding with that, I'll mention that there's another trial going on right now. It's not in Belgrade or in The Hague, but in Washington. This is the trial of General Johnny Lumintang. He's an Indonesian general who was implicated in planning and executing massive crimes in East Timor in 1999, far beyond anything attributed to Milosevic, I should say. Furthermore, not only are these much worse in character, they also happen to be war crimes, not just crimes against humanity, that is, crimes in the course of aggression, the most serious kind. Furthermore, these crimes were not carried out under bombing by a superpower. In fact, not even under any fighting. There was nothing going on, just plain massive attacks on the civilian population. There was a superpower involved, actually two, the United States and Britain. They had been involved for a long time, 25 years in fact. They were involved in arming and training the killers. That continued right through 1999. In earlier years, their involvement actually was genocidal, one of the places where that overused word really applies. Relative to the population, the deaths, killings were probably greater than anything since the Holocaust. And that continued through 1999. The U.S.-British client destroyed about 70% of the country, drove out 85% of the population, killed nobody knows how many people, and nobody ever will know for a very good reason. The United States prevented the dispatch of any forensic experts, quite different from Kosovo, where the place was flooded by forensic experts to try to dig out crimes of the official enemy, but here they were withheld despite pleas from the UN and Australia. Furthermore, the U.S. has blocked any tribunal, so there'll never be an investigation. But there is a trial going on, Lumintang's trial. Lumintang was served court papers in Washington on March 27th. He was in Washington at the invitation of the State Department. He's one of their favorites. The State Department was pretty upset by the fact that he was handed a subpoena, and the U.S. apologized profusely to the government of Indonesia for this indignity. He was quickly spirited out of the country, but the trial is proceeding in absentia and in silence. There hasn't been a word about it. Good reasons. Unlike Milosevic, under NATO bombing, Lumintang is a U.S.-run criminal responsible for much worse crimes. So therefore, his trial, right in Washington, not very easy to ignore, has to be ignored by the usual principles. Well, of course, it could be argued that Lumintang is not the top commander, which is correct. He's greatly implicated. He was not the top commander. The top commander was General Wiranto. He was granted an amnesty in advance, just in case there ever might be a tribunal, not that there's much threat of that. The top leaders are, of course, exempt. And the decisive role of the United States and Britain, that's also exempt. And it is decisive, right back through the Ford and particularly Carter years. In fact, the role of the United States is virtually entirely suppressed in the United States, has been all along, still is. In Britain, not so completely. Britain is a less disciplined society than us, not just in this respect. Even worse than that, the current story that's now around, and that will enter history, of course, is that the U.S. led the humanitarian intervention in East Timor because it was so appalled by the crimes, which in fact it was carrying out. This was after it had unfortunately overlooked the crimes of the past 25 years over which it was presiding and for which it provided the crucial military and diplomatic support. With about a third of the population wiped out, all thanks to the complicity of the media and the intellectual culture generally, folks like us, people who are always very agitated about the other guy's crimes. Well, these are near historical universals. It's all too easy to continue this shameful story. Just keeping to the Sunday New York Times, which incidentally I haven't exhausted, I've just sampled. I could go on for another hour on that, but I won't. And I should say that the U.S. and Britain are by no means unusual, and as I said before, this is pretty standard. The main difference between the United States and Britain and other societies is that the United States and Britain have never been defeated. And furthermore, they have been dominant societies. And for those reasons alone, they have nothing to regret. It follows that if you're not defeated and you're in a dominant position, you didn't do anything wrong. That's kind of like a principle of logic. Therefore, you have nothing to regret. And in fact, you can bask in self-adulation for your courageous leadership in the cause of human rights and freedom and so on. And it's essentially the task of the intellectual community to make sure that this all works very smoothly. And it does. There's rarely a hitch. Well, I should say, and for accuracy, that there sometimes is a hitch. So the charge is not totally accurate. Our country, the United States, as you know, was founded and developed, in fact, on the basis of terrible crimes, slavery and the most extreme ethnic cleansing in history, I suppose. And there have been occasional statements of regret, never any official statements. One of the rare examples, and they are very rare in high places, is John Quincy Adams. He was a major contributor to massive crimes. And long after his involvement in that, long after he was out of office, Adams deplored, I'm quoting, "the heinous sins for which I believe God will one day bring this nation to judgment." He hoped that this belated stand would somehow aid that hapless race of Native Americans that we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty. He hoped in vain, of course. The attack escalated very quickly. And continued until the dispossession and the extermination were almost complete, leaving us miraculously guiltless in the eyes of the history that we construct. Actually, how guiltless we are, you can test from your own recent experience. You're all beneficiaries of a good education. I'm sure that, like most people, you were paying a lot of attention last November to stories coming from a county in Florida. The date line was Seminole County, Florida. That was the scene of various electoral shenanigans. You can now carry out an experiment. You can ask yourselves how you would have reacted if there was an election in Germany now and everyone was focusing their eyes on electoral shenanigans in, say, Kike County, Bavaria. If you can imagine that, you're looking in a mirror. You might, if you don't know why, you ought to find out why. That's back to John Quincy Adams, in fact. Let's go back to all of these are just among the prerequisites of power. You're powerful, you're allowed to do these things. These are illustrations of the truisms that I mentioned. Well, let's look at the question a little bit more generally, back off a little. Actually, the question has been addressed at a very question of whether this will lead to self-destruction. I'm now giving an interpretation of an article that didn't interpret what he said the way I do, but I think it applies. The general question was addressed by the grand old man of American biology, Ernst Mayr of Harvard. He wrote an article a couple of years ago on the adaptive value of higher intelligence, and he was pretty skeptical about it. His reasons were that he said we've had about 50 billion species since the origin of life, only one of which achieved the intelligence needed to establish a civilization. It did so very recently in a very small breeding group from which we're all descended. Probably were lots of other close relatives, but they're gone, probably exterminated, along with big mammals. Anyhow, that's what's left, and that's the one exception. He concludes, Mayr, that this kind of evolutionary accident is not favored by selection. The history of life on Earth, he says, refutes the claim that it's better to be smart than stupid. The successful organisms are stupid. They are adapted to very narrow ecological niches, beetles, bacteria, actually phage, which are in mass, I suppose, the most successful. Capacity for rapid mutation helps. Mayr adds the rather somber observation that the average life expectancy of the species on Earth is about 100,000 years. It's just about the lifespan of the one species that most radically broke the pattern, and now faces the question of whether it's better to be smart than stupid. That's the question I'm asking. Well, the species is certainly smart enough to have developed the capacity to destroy itself, no doubt about that. And it's also demonstrated that capacity quite consistently throughout history, quite dramatically so in the past several hundred years, with an assault on the environment that sustains life, on the diversity of more complex organisms, and on each other as well. Just the last century, there were about 100 million deaths which are directly attributable to war. The last decade, contrary to what's often said, brought nothing new. The consequences of the collapse of the British and the French and the Portuguese empires were far more destructive than what followed the collapse of the East European tyrannies, and in fact those still remain very prominently on the front pages today, decades later. That's contrary to what's commonly claimed, but takes us back to the truisms I mentioned earlier. Many of the conflicts of the past decade can be attributed to an enemy empire that collapsed, leaving a terrible legacy, namely the Soviet Union. So therefore those atrocities are real, as distinct from the legacy of our friends and allies, which is incomparably worse, but not real by virtue of the historical truism that of immunity of power and privilege from inspection. Even though the 90s were not unusual, and in fact less destructive than the collapse of earlier empires, Western empires, and even though the number of interstate conflicts has declined quite sharply through the 90s, nevertheless it wasn't a pretty decade. By 1998, internal to state, interstate conflicts had left about 5 million dead, 10 million refugees, 5 million people internally displaced. 40% of those are in Colombia, where the regular increase, about 300,000 a year, of the past decade is expected to accelerate pretty sharply as Washington's war moves into full gear. It's Clinton's Plan Colombia. And that's in addition to over 1 million who just fled the country. More ominously still, the kind of intelligence needed to establish a civilization, to which Ernst Mayr referred, it has constructed particular kinds of dominant civilizations. and they are based on institutional structures that do increase the likelihood of dreadful outcomes. The most obvious example is just the international system, which is designed in such a way, structured in such a way that it tends to enhance an apparently inexorable drive to adapt modern technology to the most destructive ends. Nuclear weapons are the most threatening example, and in deference to the principle of looking at ourselves, we might attend to our own the situation right here. The primacy assigned to nuclear weapons in the highest level strategic planning of the Clinton years. And there's a reason. So quoting from documents of the Strategic Command, highest level planning group. They say, unlike chemical or biological weapons, the extreme destruction from a nuclear explosion is immediate, with few or any palliatives to reduce its effect. So therefore, the planners recommend that nuclear weapons be visibly available, because although we are not likely to use nuclear weapons in less than matters of the greatest national importance, which is reassuring, I suppose, nevertheless they cast a shadow over every crisis or conflict. Furthermore, it's beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements of government may appear to be potentially out of control, that the United States may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked, should be a part of the national persona we project. That's what's called credibility in public discourse. And it's projected. The world is very frightened, including Europe. The U.S. must therefore reject the basic principle of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, namely that nuclear powers make a good faith effort to eliminate nuclear weapons, and the U.S. must retain them as the basis for our strategic posture. That includes the right of first use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear powers which have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's all very explicit. In any country that valued its freedom, this would be all over the front pages and would have been for years since it's been declassified. The basic conclusions have been approved in presidential directives, Clinton directives. They authorize first use, and they maintain nuclear weapons in launch on warning posture that perpetuates a high alert regime of the past years with the ever-present danger to survival. There are new programs that are being initiated to implement these decisions. There is a change in the post-Cold War period. So the Pentagon, its own internal documents, right after the Cold War ended, recommended and has implemented a change from targeting what it primarily called the weapons-rich environment of the Soviet Union to the target-rich environment of the rest of the world, the third world, which has actually been the main target of U.S. military action right throughout the Cold War and is remaining so, apart from some modification of pretexts that the Cold War required. It's a major change since the end of the Cold War is change of pretexts and elimination of a deterrent to U.S. violence. And it's even made pretty explicit. More evidence that it may not be better to be smart than stupid is the National Missile Defense Program. There's a standard criticism of this, namely that it would be useless, since there are easy modes of delivery that don't require missiles. Graham Allison, who's leading strategic analyst over at the Harvard Kennedy School, pointed out that if terrorists wanted to smuggle a nuclear warhead into New York City, all they'd have to do is wrap it in a bale of marijuana. Another common argument is that they won't work. That's the standard criticism. It's not going to work. A much more dangerous possibility is that it might work, or that it might even appear to be working. Remember that in issues of survival, like nuclear strategy, appearance has got to be interpreted as reality. Can't take any chances. So if there's any possibility that it might work, it's extremely dangerous. As long as it's not going to work, it's just a waste of, it's just a way to fund high-tech industry. If it looks as if it might work, however, then it's really dangerous. And U.S. intelligence estimates have been pretty clear about this. They've predicted that the deployment of a national missile defense that looks feasible is, I'm quoting now, is going to impel China to develop new nuclear-armed missiles, expanding its nuclear arsenal by a factor of 10, prompting India and Pakistan to respond with their own buildups, with a likely ripple effect to the Middle East. These same analyses, and plenty of others, point out that the Russians' only rational response would be to maintain and strengthen the existing Russian nuclear force. U.S. negotiators, Clinton-era negotiators, in fact encouraged Russia to adopt a launch-on-warning strategy themselves. The idea was to alleviate Russian concerns and to induce them to accept the national missile defense and the revision of the ABM treaty. That's a proposal that's pretty bizarre, one expert commented, because we know their warning system is full of holes, so it simply maximizes the threat to us and everyone else. There was a UN conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty last May. It was very broad, in fact, universal condemnation of the national missile defense on grounds that it would undermine decades of arms control agreements, provoke a new weapons race, but both political parties in the United States are committed to it, though at different rates. Very few, including allies, pay much attention to the tales about rogue states. Canadian military planners, for example, advised the government that the goal of the national missile defense is more to preserve U.S. NATO freedom of action than because the United States really fears North Korean or Iranian threats. It's declassified briefings. Well, the reasons commonly given for this are the pressure of military industry and so on, which could be. I suspect myself, and I don't prove it, that a non-trivial factor in this may be traced back again to cultural patterns. In particular, a kind of a curious paranoid streak in American culture, which may well be the result of centuries of victories against much weaker enemies, facing no military threat since the War of 1812. So the bully in the schoolyard may well come to fear that everyone hates him for some reason. As compared with other countries, there are remarkably high levels of fear in the United States. That's of all sorts of things. Crime, terrorism, aliens among us, Judgment Day, just about anything you can think of except for the real threats to the United States and the world, which are high and probably increasing. Now that would be something of a problem if we were talking about Afghanistan. But we're not. It's vastly more significant when we're talking about the most advanced civilization that intelligence has been able to create and the most dominant. Well, these global concerns are not alleviated by other U.S. stands. Last November 1999, the United States blocked the UN General Assembly resolution opposing space-based weapons. It was passed 138 to 0, the U.S. and Israel alone abstaining, but a U.S. abstention is a veto. 2 years earlier, the U.S. Space Command published what it called its vision for the year 2020, which called for what they call full spectrum dominance, including control of space, military control, in order to protect U.S. interests and investments. Well, there are plenty of threats in the world, but the major problems lie right at home and hence are within the sphere of our influence and control, which brings us right back to the truisms that I mentioned at the outset. Well, again, a lot more to say about this, but let's turn to another domain. So consider something nice and mild, not nuclear weapons, neoclassical markets. Markets in which isolated individuals seek only to maximize a particular form of self-interest, and certainly a form that's consciously constructed with very great effort, with perceptions instituted by vast industries that are devoted to implanting and reinforcing them. In the United States, about 1/6 of gross domestic product, that's well over $1 trillion a year, is devoted to marketing. Much of it is just manipulation and control, trying to institute these values, starting with infancy. Well, these constructed systems have a number of well-known problems. One is that unborn generations who are going to face the consequences have no vote in the market, from which it follows that their interests count as zero in the market system. They don't enter into consideration in a well-functioning market. That alone tends to undermine the possibilities of the sustainable development on which survival relies. These threats are currently being enhanced very consciously by dedicated efforts to weaken the institutional structures that might address these externalities, as they're called. And even more important, to undermine the culture of sympathy and solidarity that sustains them. Now, this last commitment, I think, is pretty important. I believe it's the driving force behind the propaganda efforts that are designed to undermine popular support for healthcare systems of the kind that are found in other industrial societies, and to create a largely artificial sense of crisis about the schools and Social Security, and in fact about any institutions that rely on the dangerous sentiment that we might care about somebody else, not just ourselves. The Social Security scam has other roots, and it's a scam. Take a look if you don't believe it. Whatever one thinks about transferring Social Security to stocks, to the stock market, there are two consequences which are absolutely clear and undebatable. One is that it's a huge bonanza for Wall Street. Another is that it entails that working people are going to end up with a tremendous stake in the value of stocks, the stocks on which their survival, post-retirement survival, depends on the survival of their families. That means that working people will have a strong reason to oppose decent wages and working conditions, health and safety standards in the workplace, the social and economic rights that are given formal endorsement in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but which the U.S. strongly opposes, and other principles that are naturally despised by the unaccountable private tyrannies that dominate the domestic and the international society in close alliance with one another and the powerful states that they largely dominate. That's another prescription for disaster, and not so in such a long term. Well, it's commonly claimed that there's a huge payoff for these problems, what's called globalization or the new economy or free markets or other terms of propaganda, I believe, referring to the social and economic policies of the past 20-odd years. According to the story, they have led to unprecedented economic growth, though unfortunately a few have been left behind and we have to do something about that, all led by the spectacular fairy tale economy of the United States. You've read this 1,000 times. So take, say, the most critical voice in the New York Times, Anthony Lewis, on March 10th. He informed us that, I'm quoting, "The greatest economic boom in America's history, in fact in the world's history, came in the 1990s. What is Lewis referring to? He's referring to the fact that an unusually slow recovery from the recession of the early 90s was compensated by a growth spurt in the last few years that brought the growth rate for the 90s to about the level of the rather dismal 20 years that preceded it. All of that is well below the level of economic growth or productivity growth in the first, what many economists call the golden age of Western capitalism. That's from World War II up till the mid-1970s. It was in the mid-1970s that the Bretton Woods system of regulated capital was dismantled, and the new era of globalization and neoliberalism was instituted, bringing with it, uncontroversially, a substantial deterioration in macroeconomic indicators wherever the rules were followed, including the United States. Furthermore, even the relatively anemic growth in the United States through the 90s was unusual in that it left out most of the population. I don't know if this earlier period in U.S. history of which that's true. During the golden age, prior to neoliberalism, during the Golden Age, wages and benefit rose very rapidly across the board. Just to give you some figures, from 1947 to 1973, real wages rose 75%. From 1973 to 1998, they fell 9%, back to the level of 1967. Furthermore, it was level growth in the Golden Age. In fact, the lowest quintile had the highest growth rate, and the highest quintile had the lowest, and benefits and so on went along with it. During the globalization phase, the benefits of the much slower growth are very highly skewed. Even after the growth spurt of the late 90s, the male median wages are below 1989, peak of the last business cycle. For a large majority of the population, they're well below the 1970s. Family incomes have been more or less sustained, but that's by a far heavier workload. In fact, the heaviest in the industrial world by the early 1990s. Take Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, median income declined by, half above, half below, declined by about 10% in the 1990s. It was even steeper decline in Connecticut. In California, purchasing power per family dropped about $1,000 during the 1990s, according to a recent Federal Reserve Bank of California report. Notice that these are the stars of the new economy, real fancy places. Social indicators have been declining since the mid-1970s. Before that, they rose, kind of tracking gross domestic product. They've been declining since. They're now about the level of 40 years ago. The poverty levels, approximately like 20 years ago. It's the highest in the industrial world. Second is England, the other country that's more or less kept to the neoliberal rules. Furthermore, even this much less than impressive economic performance is very fragile. In fact, everybody knows that now. It's fueled mainly by consumer spending. The consumer spending is stimulated by fanatic propaganda efforts. One consequence of it is that it's led to unprecedented debt, household debt past disposable income last year for the first time in American history, and also a huge trade deficit. Now, the trade deficit is not much of a problem for policymakers. Two MIT Nobel laureates had an op-ed in the Times about that, retired economics professors yesterday, and they're right. It's not. They talked about the threat of the deficit. It's not much of a problem to policymakers, but they didn't point out that it's a major problem for the population. If you look at polls, it's been the most important economic issue for the population for some years. It doesn't enter into political campaigns at all, but that's for another reason. That's because this is an issue on which the business community has one view and the population has another view. And such issues cannot enter into the political arena in our democratic society because of the way it's structured. But if you look at polls, the trade deficit and capital mobility generally, people don't call it that, but that's what we're talking about, is the leading economic issue because people understand that it's a threat to job quality and job security, as indeed it is. These problems are worldwide. They're not just the U.S. So the executive secretary of the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean, Jose Antonio Ocampo, he gave a talk at the American Economic Society in January in which he reviewed the record for Latin America. He's been a kind of a booster for this system for years. And he pointed out that trade and investment did increase during the prescribed reforms, but he says the enthusiastic predictions have turned out to be a mirage. Latin America, he points out, is the region where the reforms were most strictly enforced. And growth fell under the reforms to a little over half the level of the 3 decades of state-led economic development from the 1950s through the 1970s, before pre-liberalization and globalization. In contrast, he points out, the one success story of the new era is East Asia and China, where the regimes dramatically didn't follow the rules. Furthermore, though he didn't point this out, this is fully consistent with 2 centuries of economic history. including the United States. It's an interesting story, too long to review here. So what leads Anthony Lewis and other commentators to such curious fantasies? Well, you can guess the reason. Narrow circles have indeed benefited enormously, and that includes the folks who tell everyone else the happy news. People like us, and the circles in which we live, for the most part, are doing fine, spectacularly. Well, if you keep to the approved modern doctrine that nothing matters except me, well, the conclusions are not all that strange, however outlandish they are in fact. Let me stress that this is a modern doctrine. These doctrines would have appalled Adam Smith and other founders of classical liberalism. In fact, they're a major assault on Enlightenment values, as is the structure of the dominant institutions. Concentrations of unaccountable private power, unaccountable to the public, of course, administering and controlling markets in violation of market principles, controlling, in fact, owning the doctrinal institutions, and with an overwhelming influence on the powerful states and international institutions, the ones that modestly call themselves the international community. What are the expectations for the future? Well, we have expert predictions about that, too. The U.S. intelligence community, with specialists from the academic and world and private sector, they just published a report on predictions for the year 2015, and they give several scenarios. The most optimistic scenario that they give is that globalization proceeds on course, and in that case they say its evolution will be rocky, marked by chronic financial volatility and a widening economic divide. Well, financial volatility means slower growth and less productive long-term investment. And a widening economic divide means less convergence to a global market, that is, to a single price and wage. So what they're predicting is less globalization in the technical sense, but more globalization in the doctrinally approved sense, which doesn't have anything to do with globalization, but has to do with capital mobility and investor rights. That's the most optimistic scenario. Then there's some bad ones. For Latin America, their prediction is that the oil producers, Mexico, Venezuela, and Brazil, ought to do all right, but most others will fall behind, in fact, very badly behind. Mexico and Brazil, however, will be, I'm quoting, increasingly confident and capable actors. That's an interesting comment, because they certainly know that Mexico and Brazil have the highest equality in the world. So they're not talking about Mexico and Brazil. They're not going to be confident and capable actors, rather small sectors within Mexico and Brazil, which happen to be linked to international capital. They're going to be separated from the rest by an increasing divide, according to the best-case scenario of the experts. Mexico's a particularly interesting case. It's described as the star pupil of Latin America. And the reason is it's been following the rules of the so-called Washington Consensus, neoliberal rules for 20 years, and also it had the extra advantage of benefiting from NAFTA since 1994. So what happened? Well, for the last 20 years, wages have steadily declined, probably about 50% by 1990, another 25% decline since NAFTA. That includes a 10% decline even in the manufacturing industries, which are supposed to be the best performers. Poverty levels are up 10% since NAFTA. They're now increasing at about twice the level of the population. Income inequality has deepened. Economic power is more concentrated. I'll quote from a recent study of the Latin American section of the Woodrow Wilson Center. 50 firms account for half the exports. 20 corporate groups control 3/5 of the national economic output. Small Mexican companies face nearly insurmountable financing costs. Trade and farming continue to shed excess workers. Labor-intensive industries, which is almost everything there, agriculture, light industry, can't compete internationally. all of these costs, incidentally, are radically underestimated because of the highly ideological method of estimating economic costs. It's not neutral. So not counted here are the costs of the huge flow of migrant workers trying to survive, coming to the United States where they work at very low wages, no benefits, awful conditions,